Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute. I'm Angela Leung. I'm the principal coordinator of a CRF, which means collaborative research funded project, which is called Making Modernity in East Asia, Technologies of Everyday Life, 19th to 21st Century, which was submitted by the Institute since in 2017. We began to work on this project in 2017, and right now we are sort of reaping the fruits of our hard work at this stage, 5 to 6 years after the beginning of the project. Of course, we were interrupted by COVID since 2020. But we are happy to see some fruits coming out from this project. And today, we are particularly thrilled to present this newly published book called Infrastructure and the Remaking of Asia, published by the University of Hawaii Press and edited by Max Hirsh and Till Mostowlansky, who will be sitting there in a minute. Infrastructure is one of the main themes that goes through the whole project. And I think in the presentation of the book, you will find the importance of this concept of infrastructure in our project. I don't think I will take more time in presenting our entire project, and I will perhaps present the 4 speakers who will present the book idea and the idea of infrastructure to you. Now, Max Hirsh is the editor, one of the 2 editors, and he is a PhD from Harvard, and he is right now managing director of the Airport City Academy and a research fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder. And he's a leading global expert on infrastructure and urban development, and the author of a book by himself, Airport Urbanism, Infrastructure and Mobility in Asia, and editor of aviation blog, airporturbanism.com. So he will be the leading speaker in the forum. The second speaker will be Till Mostowlansky, who is the second editor of this book. He's PhD from University of Bern. He's a research professor of anthropology at the Geneva Graduate Institute, where he leads the collaborative research project Quiet Aid, Service and Salvation in the Balkans to Bengal Complex. He is the author of Azan on the Moon, Untangling Modernity Along Tajikistan's Pamir Highway. Both Max and Till were members of the Institute some years ago. Max I think both of them were postdoc, and then Max later became a research officer. But then they had very successful career, and they left the Institute and worked in Europe. The third speaker will be Hallam Stevens. If you came yesterday, he was the lecturer on his work on biotechnology, electronic industry in Singapore. And Hallam is also a core collaborator of our CRF project. He is also a Harvard PhD. He's a professor. Right now, he is a professor at the Interdisciplinary Studies and an associate dean at James Cook University at Townsville. For a long time, he worked in Singapore at the Nanyang University of Science and Technology in Singapore. And then, of course, he's another core member of our CRF project. The fourth speaker will be Dorothy Tang, another core collaborator of the CRF. She's also a Harvard PhD. And right now she is assistant professor of architecture at the National University of Singapore. Before that, Dorothy also worked as a assistant professor at the architecture faculty of Hong Kong U. She is a registered landscape architect. Her research and practice focus on urban and rural communities undergoing large-scale environmental changes. They were all at some moment they were all in Hong Kong, and even though they have left Hong Kong, now they come back and present this work for us. It's a great honor. Except Hallam. He has never worked in Hong Kong, but he has been a very close collaborator of ours. And another thing that I would like to say about these four global young scholars is that they speak all sorts of languages. I think together they represent something like half of the world's languages that are spoken, and they are truly. I mean, they work in Europe. They have worked in America. They have worked in Europe, and they know Central Asia very well. And infrastructure is a perfect theme for them to present today. And I'm sure that you will find the book fascinating. And it has just come out, and we look forward to reading it as an e-book and as a hard copy. So please join me in welcoming our four young scholars.
I will stand.
We can
Okay,
both present here together.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Angela, thank you so much for that introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of my co-editor, Mostowlansky, and I, we're really looking forward to having a conversation with you today about infrastructure and the remaking of Asia. Before we start, just a couple of thanks are in order. First and foremost to Angela Leung for making this possible. This is very much the direct outcome of the project that she mentioned, the Making Modernity in East Asia project, which to my mind is one of the most successful outputs that Hong Kong U has had in the last 10 years. So thank you very much both to you, Angela, and also to you, Izumi Nakayama, for collaboration on this over the past 2 years. Maybe on a personal note, I would say this is the first time in 3 years since the pandemic that it's been possible for me to come to Hong Kong, and it was, to be honest, quite painful to not be able to come during that time. So I'd like to thank you both very much for making it possible for us to reunite here in a nice way. Maybe before we start, just in addition, we'd really like to thank the entire Institute staff for supporting this event and also for supporting this project over the years, in particular Joan, Yvonne, Terry, Louis, Louise, Hilson, Roy, and May. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. One quick note before I turn things over to Till. You will see that under the book cover, which you see here, there is a URL, infrastructureasia.net. Thanks to a generous grant from the Swiss National Science Foundation, we have the pleasure to offer this book in an open access format. What that means is that you can go to this website and download the book for free. Of course, if you would like a paperback, you can also order a paperback on that website, but I encourage you to check that out. Till.
Yeah, thank you so much, Max. And I would also like to first express my gratitude to the Institute and Angela and everyone working at the Institute in particular. It's really a great pleasure to be back in Hong Kong. I haven't been here in 4 years, and it's been a wonderful experience to be back again. Thank you so much. So with regard to today's talk and the introduction of the book, so what we're going to do is we're basically going to introduce the framework, the concept of the book first. That's going to be Max and I. But then we're also going to have two authors who are going to speak about their chapters, Hallam Stevens and Dorothy Tang, and they will sort of be integrated into our introductory talk, and then as we go through the chapters, sort of make more substantial introductions to their own work. But now, first to kind of the general framework of the book.
Sure. So we're going to start by looking at two questions today. Why infrastructure and why Asia? Well, in the 21st century, the development of infrastructure has undergone a seismic shift from west to east. So once concentrated heavily in Europe and North America, global infrastructure today is focused squarely on Asia. Plenty of statistics testify to that geographic pivot. Let me just throw two of those out at you. In 1995, for example, road investment in Germany was triple that of China. 20 years later, China was outspending Germany by a factor of 35. We can see similar patterns in other domains of infrastructure. So until the 1990s, for example, North America was by far the world's largest aviation market. It was hosting about a third of all global air traffic. Asia's contribution by comparison was quite small, maybe about 7% of global total. If we fast forward again 25 years, we can see that Asia in that time quintupled its share of traffic. It overtook North America as the top source of air travelers, and in Asia, 13 of the world's 20 busiest airports were built, most of them built from scratch. Now, media outlets often cite these kinds of figures to contrast the rise of Asia, and in particular China, with the perceived decline of the West. In this book, we want to go beyond the statistical and the sensational and investigate kind of the deeper implications of infrastructure's pivot from West to East.
And obviously one of the enduring challenges in writing about infrastructure, as is the case with many concepts in the social sciences, is the slippery nature of the term, or what, with regard to infrastructure, the historian Rosalind Williams has called the promiscuity of infrastructure. And sort of this setting in many ways also accounts for the enduring appeal of the term, and has really over the past 2 decades become sort of a flourishing field of study in the social sciences and the humanities. At various times over the past century, the term infrastructure has been applied both to very tangible development projects such as hydroelectric dams, seaports, and suspension bridges. But it also has been used to think about intangible support systems for education, social welfare, and governance. And scholars in very different fields apply rather different conceptual frameworks. So that I think it's important to emphasize that there's not really one understanding of infrastructure as such.
I think you probably appreciate that infrastructure's flexibility poses kind of a challenge for a book like ours with multiple audiences. And I'm speaking of this from my own experience as someone who's both conducting research on infrastructure but also actively involved in producing infrastructure. In my case, I work on projects in aviation and aviation-led urban planning and development. So we're kind of trying to find a way to connect the dots between research and practice. And in response to that, we developed a working definition of infrastructure that makes sense both from kind of a scholarly perspective, but it's also coherent with the common usage of the term infrastructure in the professional world, planners, policymakers, and engineers. So we define infrastructure as the physical material backbone of transportation, energy use, resource extraction, and telecommunications. This definition that you see here has achieved broad consensus across a variety of academic disciplines. It's also endured across time, across cultural contexts, and intellectual trends. Now, at the same time, by merging conceptual approaches from the fields of anthropology, urban planning, science and technology studies, we locate infrastructure at the intersection of its social, material, and regulatory components, none of which could effectively operate without the others.
And especially over the last 2 decades, there have really been a number of excellent studies on infrastructure in Asia in particular. And many of these studies have been conducted within the boundaries of a single nation state. And this has certainly changed with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has brought forth a number of cross-regional surveys on China's infrastructure endeavors in Asia. And we believe these studies provide very helpful overviews of China's broader geopolitical ambitions, but they're also often not based on fieldwork or archival research. And what we suggest in the book is really to bring together the expertise of 10 authors, sort of rigorous, site-based empirical research of individual experts, and then try and draw connections across Asia that perhaps invite comparison less often, such as, for instance, between Southeast Asia and the Middle East.
So with that in mind, we investigate the multiple pathways through which expertise is transferred from place to place. And then we look at how those infrastructural ideals are appropriated, modified, hybridized with vernacular or local practices. And by doing that, what we hope is that the book is enhancing our understanding of how the mobility of experts, the mobility of building materials, technologies, and infrastructural models affects broader changes in the making and remaking of Asia. Now, this framework allows us to look at the social dimensions of infrastructural development by situating the role of experts and expert knowledge in relation to infrastructure's modifications by its end users. So some of the questions that we ask in the book are, how are infrastructure networks envisioned by those who design and finance them? And to what extent are those visions shared by the people who build, operate, and use them? What happens when infrastructural techniques and technologies are transferred from one social and geographic context to another? What's the nature of interactions among government agencies, transnational funding bodies, and design firms, and what kinds of infrastructural strategies do these collaborations either open up or foreclose? Now, why do we do that? Well, I think a lot of scholarship thinks of, and I have to say, I was quite pleased when I checked in the hotel yesterday and discovered that this is the view from my hotel room. Very glad to see this again. So why do we take that approach? Well, I think a lot of scholarship kind of thinks of infrastructure as the physical outcome of specific political agenda and economic ideologies. But we were talking and we said, you know what, let's think outside the box. What if we begin with the idea that infrastructure has an agency and an autonomy of its own? That infrastructure can directly influence political outcomes, social attitudes, cultural practices, and ideological positions. And again, this is kind of based on my own experience as a hybrid researcher and practitioner consultant. As many infrastructure professionals will acknowledge in private, once a project gets going and is underway, things rarely go according to plan. The reality of developing infrastructure is messy, it's unpredictable, and it can go in a lot of unforeseen directions. It's kind of like a book or a work of art. Over time, an infrastructure project, like an airport, a road, an electricity grid, has a tendency to take on a life of its own that's independent of its original creator's intents.
So the 10 chapters in the book investigate how infrastructure produces new urban forms, new ways of living, and perhaps also new modes of thinking, which all often diverge significantly from the outcomes that were intended at the outset of the planning stage. And in that sense, our authors look at infrastructure both from above, as perceived by experts and decision makers, but also from below, as experienced by employees and everyday users as well. And to connect these different actors and to draw also connections between infrastructure's physical and social dimensions, we specifically employ the concept of scale. Scholars in the humanities and social sciences quite often use scale basically to explain how humans rely on levels, hierarchies, and sizes to organize and also make sense of the world around them. And they imagine a connectivity between different scales as grounded very differently in materiality, defined by territoriality, but also organized along networks. And in the book, these three approaches to scale basically serve us to organize the chapters, and also the ways in which our authors analyze the dimensions of infrastructure from very different disciplinary perspectives. But throughout the book, there are three overarching themes that run through many of the chapters to some degree, and these are climate change, digitalization, and China's emergence as a superpower.
So these three themes, again, climate change, digitalization, China's rise as a superpower, they run through, I would say, all 10 chapters in the book. These are chapters looking at transportation, energy, telecommunication, and resource extraction projects that are taking place in China, the Middle East, and Central and Southeast Asia, because when we said Asia, we really meant all of Asia. As you can appreciate, this is a challenge to put together this kind of book in this cross-regional perspective. To assist us with that, we came up with the idea of kind of a dynamic table of contents, which you can see if you go to the website infrastructureasia.net. So if you click on any of those dots, it will pull up the different chapters and the topics in it. Our authors, and we're very fortunate to, in addition to Till and myself, to have Dorothy and Hallam here today, who are going to be sharing a little bit about their contribution to the book. Our authors come from 6 academic fields: anthropology, geography, history, science and technology studies, landscape architecture, and urban planning. The first essay, which you see here, it looks at how China became a geological force in the Arctic. So as many of us know, China is the world's largest consumer of commodities and also the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. It's also expanded its infrastructure in the Arctic, and what our co-author Mia Bennett, who is also a Hong Kong U alum now at the University of Washington in Seattle, what Mia does is identify these infrastructure investments as a driver of Arctic climate change. And she argues that China has become a so-called geological agent that's capable of altering the Earth's physical structure. She offers an sophisticated insight into how national economic policy, so in this case capitalism with Chinese characteristics, affects global ecological transformations.
Then we have the second chapter by Gökçe Günel, and in the chapter Gökçe charts the rise of Turkish power ships, basically as floating provisional energy infrastructure. These are offshore power plants which attach themselves to national grids and then supply cheap supplementary electricity. And it is really through these power ships that Turkey, much like China in the Arctic, basically seeks to assert itself across a vastly enlarged and loosely defined Asian domain. And I think this is not represented in the chapter, but we see the importance of these Turkish power ships now in the Black Sea with Ukraine, basically supplying electricity to Ukraine that has a destroyed energy infrastructure.
The next chapter is again by a Hong Kong U alum, Andrew Toland, who used to be in the Faculty of Architecture here, now at UTS in Sydney. Andrew looks at the man-made underground caverns that enabled Singapore to become one of the world's largest oil refining and trading hubs. So limited land supply drove policymakers to conceptualize the country's subsurface as a new frontier for development. Andrew uses the term petroleumscaping to show us that remaking of Singapore, from a city-state anxious about its lack of land and natural resources to a country in which both of those things, land and natural resources, can be artificially constructed.
Then we have Hallam's chapter, and I'm just going to say a few words and then hand over to you, Hallam. So Hallam Stevens investigates Teleview, a video text system that operated in Singapore in the 1980s and 90s, and essentially examines the state's vision for Teleview and how the system was received by its users, but also how emerging digital technologies are basically used by Singaporean leaders and sort of to explore what kind of society could be built through that networked online interaction.
Thanks. And I should say congratulations and thanks to Max and Till as well. I mean, it's been a pleasure to be part of this project, and I also know how hard it is to muster herd academics into actually pulling a book like this together. So it's a real achievement. So let me say a little bit about this chapter. So Teleview is what's called a videotech system. If you've ever heard of Minitel in France, there were various versions of this that existed. The UK also had a system called Prestel that kind of emerged in the 1980s. And these are basically, so you can see it's quite a nice, basically these are kind of a box that sits on top of your desk or in your house, and it has some kind of a modem in it, and you could hook it up to the telephone line, and through that telephone line you could receive all kinds of data, basically, right? So a kind of, in some ways, a kind of proto World Wide Web established by the Singapore government during the 1980s. Teleview had one interesting kind of feature that was different to Minitel in France, for example, was that it also, in addition to receiving signals by the telephone line, it had a system where it would also have a VHF, UHF antenna, and it would receive photo quality images that were broadcast basically over radio waves, right, over television frequencies. So you could have, because this at that time in the 1980s, there was just not simply enough bandwidth on a telephone line to transmit images. But in Singapore, they wanted specifically Chinese characters. They thought, well, if you can't display Chinese characters, then this is going to be a problem. So one of the solutions to this was to actually also simultaneously transmit these photographic images. So that's what Teleview is. Why do I think it's important? Well, the usual story about this from the kind of, you read whatever existed before my chapter about Teleview, it's basically dismissed as a kind of white elephant, right? That actually this was a kind of moribund system that basically a single party state put in place to attempt to control its citizens by centralizing the control of information, and that as soon as the World Wide Web came along, it was kind of defeated, right? That it was just kind of thrown out, right? And in fact, Teleview was never that successful, right? It basically was switched on first in 1989, and then, very early 1990s, you get the World Wide Web coming online, and so it does get eclipsed very, very quickly by the World Wide Web, and only 5% of Singaporean households ever actually had Teleview hooked up. So from some point of view, it was a kind of, one can see it as a kind of failure. But what I try to do in the chapter is to kind of flip that around, and I think the infrastructure perspective is really nice for doing this here, and seeing it from a kind of infrastructure perspective, I put it in the context of what the other kind of infrastructural projects that the state was actually doing at this time. So Singapore in the 1970s and 80s had huge investments in infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure. So you think about Changi Airport, built in 1984. You think about the MRT system, first opened in 1987. You think about the highway system, which was built starting in the early 70s, but continued through most of the 1980s. So there's the port system in Singapore, which is, depending on what measure you use, has maintained, one of the largest ports in the world for the last 15 or 20 years, right? So a huge amount of infrastructural investment. And really what I argue here is that seeing this in that context, one of the things that this is doing, one of the things that all these infrastructure projects are doing, is kind of binding citizens more closely to the state, and kind of making, in some sense, the citizens be grateful for the kind of largesse that the state is providing, right? We are providing for you these great, wonderful facilities, these great roads, providing economic prosperity, and citizens repay that with kind of their loyalty. And so, this image is actually, a very useful one for talking about this, because, this actually brought many of these kind of this kind of infrastructures right into the homes of people, right? So you could look up Changi Airport schedules, or all kinds of. It was actually connected to other forms of kind of infrastructure in Singapore, and so this is very much a sense of connecting citizens to the services of government. I call this in the chapter paternalistic infrastructure, an infrastructure that is very much attempting to kind of make citizens grateful, show the state's beneficence and foresight and power in some ways as well. And I think in that frame, actually, Teleview looks more successful, although it itself went away. I think this provided a model for how the Singapore state continued to basically use digital infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure. So when the World Wide Web actually came along, right? I think actually the ways in which they have rolled out the internet and the ways in which they have continued to sort of foster the internet in all kinds of sort of curtailed but sort of semi-open ways is actually on this model of actually trying to bind citizens more closely to the state. So yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Hallam. Thank you very much. Now, continuing on the theme of networks and also the geographic theme of Southeast Asia, the next chapter is by a colleague of ours, Anto Mosen, at Northwestern University in Qatar. So what Anto does is situate Indonesian electrification projects as an effort to solidify the country's territorial integrity. Anto claims that electricity infrastructure in Indonesia suffers from a kind of center bias, not only because the government prioritizes urban areas, but also because of the country's geography, so a giant archipelago. Now, despite these efforts to centralize energy and also energy governance through a national grid, he argues that many border regions, and he demonstrates through a case study of one of these border regions, he argues that these border areas remain dependent on local and often cross-border electricity solutions.
And in a related way, Dorothy Tang is just in a second going to talk about her chapter herself, turns to Hong Kong's reservoir and aqueducts to illustrate how hydrological engineering is linked to much broader concerns about colonialism, geopolitics, and territorial integrity. And in that she focuses on Hong Kong's chronic dependence on water imports and also traces the evolution of cross-border water management systems sort of in that moment as the British colony transforms into the special administrative region of China.
Stand to the side. So my chapter uses freshwater infrastructure development in the 1960s and 70s to sort of unpack the debates that are still relevant today of autonomy and integration, particularly during the British colonial era. And before I start, maybe I would start with a couple of sort of fun facts about water in Hong Kong. And since this is presented in Hong Kong, it's nice to not have to talk about all the background. So first, I know, I was like, where is Hong Kong? It's here. So first, Hong Kong still experienced water rationing until as recent as 1982. And many of us, of course, don't remember that. And there were severe water shortages in 1963 and 1967. The second fun fact is at the time of their completion, almost every single freshwater reservoir in Hong Kong was a technological marvel. And the British are very proud of all of the accomplishments that happened here in Hong Kong. Lastly, currently about 3/4 of Hong Kong's freshwater supply is purchased from Guangdong province. So these are just sort of three overarching facts that kind of frame the way that my chapter is organized. So as we continue with a little bit of background, I want to draw your attention to sort of the two large reservoirs in the northeastern part of Hong Kong. Many of you have been there, Plover Cove and High Island, respectively completed in 1968 and 1978. And together, they contain approximately 88% of all of Hong Kong's water capacity. And so within that one decade, the Water Authority essentially quadrupled Hong Kong's water capacity. In addition to that, you see in green are the watershed boundaries and country parks that were established in 1976 to protect the water collection zones of Hong Kong and largely are protecting the urban limits of what development can be. And so these landscapes were incredibly important for water security and were protected as such. So my chapter begins to look at sort of some of the very common idioms that we're familiar with, the idea that, Hong Kong is a barren rock. And I argue that actually the narrative of the barren rock really emphasizes the co-production of landscape and security, especially for water. I argue that the politics of Hong Kong's freshwater infrastructure are a co-production of scarcity in its landscape. So for example, Hong Kong's steep topography is represented as the underlying reason for scarcity, and whether it's resources and especially water. The idiom of the barren rock refers not only to how early British colonialists viewed the natural landscape of Hong Kong, but has become this sort of metaphor for the obstacles that we face. And so the water emergencies of 1963 and 1967, and here you see a photograph, historic photograph of that one of those emergencies, coincided with significant technological innovations and landscape transformations in which Hong Kong had to maximize or find this balance between local water production and dependent of imported water. So, as a precursor to this, one example of these strange negotiations is the Shenzhen Reservoir. It was completed in 1959 as part of China's Great Leap Forward, and immediately in 1960 there was a major drought. And that was when the British colonial government reached an agreement with Guangdong for a modest amount of imported water and built the first set of infrastructure. However, this didn't really last. And in 1963, there was a major drought in which there was water rationing for 4 hours of provision every 4 days. So my uncle, for example, talked about how they would fill up the bathtub in order to have enough fresh water for cooking, for hygiene, and all sorts of things every so often, and that became a very important part of sort of negotiating daily life in 1963 and 64. And so during that time, the colonial government negotiated with Guangdong to, and this is very well known, to build an aqueduct between Dongjiang, which is a tributary of the Pearl River, to the Shenzhen Reservoir, that then would provide water into Hong Kong. And here you see some of the publicity photos that were sent to media by the Hong Kong government at that time. And so the chapter goes into a lot more details about the politics of that negotiation and how it changed various types of territories. But in addition to that particular piece of infrastructure that was about importing water, Hong Kong, the British colonial government was very cautious that this was not a long-term solution. So they built the first reservoir from the sea, which is Clover Cove. That was planned in the 1950s, at the end of the 1950s, so way before all of these crazy, water emergencies. And the idea was that they would convert a saltwater marine environment into a freshwater environment. And for those of us that understand marine environments, that's a crazy idea because there's a huge amount of salinity in the mud at the bottom of a bay. And so to convert that actually required them to complete this map. They had to build sort of temporary dams to dam it up and then build this huge, gravity structure. But after that, they had to pump all of the water out, all the saline water out, and then they had to wait for it to rain. So when the rain came in, it would flush out all the saline components and then pump that out. And they estimated it would take more than a year in order for the salinity levels in Plover Cove to reach drinking water standards, to be able to provide water. So there's a lot of things that were happening here, and they had to sort of completely convert the ecological systems here. And that's what, as a landscape architect, was fascinating to me. But unfortunately, droughts are very difficult to predict. So Plover Cove was supposed to be coming online in 1968. However, in 1967, Hong Kong had a dual crisis. And again, I don't have to explain this because you're all here. So the 1967 riots, of course, we're all very familiar with. I'm not going to go into details about it. But the timeline for that is quite important in the few events that happened in the summer of 1967. Not only did the riots break out in April, but then there were food embargoes and border disputes. And so just to back up a little bit, our agreement with China for imports of water were only between October to April. So if you think about that, right, like the moment where this all happened it actually was the moment where there was no water coming from China, and then there was this huge drought and riots. There was so many things happening, and so there's a crisis of governance for the British colonial government. And then in July, mid-July of 1967, there was a giant storm. And all of a sudden, Plover Cove, which was halfway done, filled up. And the Hong Kong government was like, well, what do we do with this extra, although saline water? So they decided, and sorry, this is a Chinese newspaper. So they decided to mix saline water from Plover Cove into the freshwater supply in the later part, in the summer of 1967 and the later part of 1967. So for about 6 months, Hong Kong's water supply had minor amounts of saline water, and they did all sorts of testing, and they argued that it was not, it wouldn't affect people's health. Of course, this is from Daobongbao, which is a leftist newspaper. They were like, how dare the British colonial government do this to us? And so there's a lot of controversy about this. There was controversies over who had saline water, who had more saline water in their freshwater supply, to the point where people in Wan Chai were like, we have more saline water, and then people in the Peak were like, well, actually, we have saline water too. To disputes about whether or not the tea houses were illegally purchasing well water for their tea, because you don't want to use saline water for your tea. How dare you? Right? So there were all of these kinds of disputes, but more importantly, the British colonial government realized that if they didn't have a longer term or better solution, that they would, in addition to the riots, have a major crisis, a political crisis at hand. So I'm not going to go into all of the details. Please read the chapter. A little pitch. But as a result, of course, things kind of got resolved towards the end. China decided to reopen the taps, and so water came flowing into Hong Kong in October based on the contract, by the way. But that kind of spurred the British colonial government into action, so they did all these really crazy types of investments. For example, they built the largest desalination plant in the world that was only in operations for 3 to 4 years. It's now demolished, unfortunately. They built a bigger reservoir from the sea, which is High Island Reservoir. For those of you that like hiking, you probably know that site. And they created all of this infrastructure in order to ensure water security. But then this happened. In 1984, the Sino-British Joint Declaration essentially shifted the nature of localized water production to this idea that we no longer have a water security issue because we can just import water from China. As a result of the Sino-British Declaration in 1984, 50% of the water then shifted to being imported from China. As a part of this large volume, they had to convert all of this investment in infrastructure to an infrastructure of storage rather than water production. As a result, various pumping stations and aqueducts were also built. The investment for that infrastructure was even greater than building the reservoirs themselves. And so there were significant shifts to the way that Hong Kong managed its freshwater. This is my last slide. Sorry that it's Hong Kong, it's great. So because of this shift, this political shift as well as this functional shift of infrastructure, the role of whether these reservoirs are still relevant, or the question of whether they're still relevant, has come into question today. So for example, in 2017, some of my colleagues in the real estate department did a study looking at real estate development and housing shortage in Hong Kong, and proposed that we should just convert Plover Cove into this massive new town by filling it up, because we no longer need this space for water. Like, we can just import water from China. Why do we even need the space anymore? And so they actually did an urban design study and created these wonderful sections that tried to understand how you would convert a drinking water reservoir into a new town. And so they were like, well, if we convert this, it's fine because we still have High Island. And so the relevance of this infrastructure is now called into question, especially as dependency and interaction with the mainland has been questioned in the past few years. So I'm just going to end here and pass it back on to Max.
Thank you very much.
Dorothy. Thank you very much. Well, sticking on geographically with this part of Asia, the next chapter that follows Dorothy's is one by our collaborator Tim Oakes, friend and colleague and director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Tim looks at how big data is producing new forms of infrastructure-led urban development in China's Guizhou province. He reveals how a new area emerged as a showcase of digital and ecological urban design techniques. In this new area, planners promote it as a space of algorithmic governance enabled by big data and by a transport grid that reorders the scale of city planning. And Tim situates this emerging node in a nationwide network of both surveillance and securitization.
Well, digitalization also plays a crucial role in Jessica Lockram's essay on ride-sharing apps amongst Ho Chi Minh City's motorbike taxi drivers. These drivers play a really integral role in keeping the city moving, providing transportation to residents, but also sharing information with visitors and in that process enhancing public safety. And basically, Lockram argues that ride-sharing apps are sort of challenging that traditional role of motorbike taxi drivers, and that digital technologies change the behavior of drivers as well as the social and spatial practices of their customers.
And then turning to the last few chapters in the book, this next one is by Till and his co-author Tobias Masche, who explore routes in the borderland of Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. Here in High Asia, as it's called, roads have long served as ambitious modernization projects, such as the Soviet Pamir Highway. The current development of Afghanistan's highway to China parallels this, but it also intersects with a parallel system of vernacular pathways and roads. What Till and Tobias do is reveal how highway projects coexist with a regional route network that enables people, goods, and information to move by less visible means.
And then we have there's a final empirical chapter, a wonderful chapter by Max, who looks at the role of foreign technical experts in developing China's aviation infrastructure. And Max traces the influx of know-how from Europe, Japan, and North America pretty much over the past 40 years. And he focuses on a series of training and technical aid programs organized by overseas universities and also airport planning firms. And Max basically argues that these foreign professionals accelerated China's reintegration into the global economy and also empowered China to re-export its infrastructural capabilities to Africa, Asia, and also the former Soviet sphere.
And turning to our concluding chapter, we're very pleased to have Ed Simpson from SOAS in London, who reflects on the future of infrastructure in relation to broader geopolitical processes of both collaboration and disengagement. Juxtaposing infrastructure's aspirational objectives with the messy reality of implementation, he observes an enduring ambition to modernize Asia through infrastructure, despite the growing challenges of climate change. Now, for Ed, this raises the crucial question of how to establish resource equality and ecological responsibility under worsening environmental conditions. So that, I would say, concludes the formal part of our presentation today. We'd like to thank you for listening, and what we'd like to do now is maybe invite our co-authors up to join us here and turn things over to you for some questions on your part. Any questions? See one in the back. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Erie from the University of Oxford. I want to congratulate all of you for a great project. How does Chinese infrastructure differ from non-Chinese infrastructure?
Well, first off, thanks for kicking off the Q&A with a very easy question. I think this is one that we get often. I would, off the top of my head, I would say two big differences are speed and scale, right? So one thing is, for those of you, and I'm sure there's many in the audience who are doing research in China, when you are, for example, talking about, in most countries, planning and building a new airport, you might be talking about one or two. In China, it's typically the program is 40, 50, 100, that sort of thing. The second thing is, of course, the ability to deliver. Now, both of these, which is considerably faster, I would say, compared to the kind of Western firms that they compete with in many markets. Now, of course, what underlies that is a particular governance model. One reason why they can deliver more quickly is there is I would say, rather modest public consultation process. There are some of the typical land ownership rights that you would get in other countries are, of course, not as relevant there. And I think these differences help us to understand both the opportunities that the Belt and Road Initiative has brought to the fore, but also many of the challenges that it has faced. So a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative is focusing on the export of certain kinds of technologies, engineering practices, construction management practices, but they take as a given this underlying governance framework. And that has been a challenge in countries like, for example, Sri Lanka, where you get into a situation where you're trying to implement something, but then you do have to deal with multiple landowners, different planning processes, different ways of engaging with the public, that sort of thing. I don't know if anyone else would like to add.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add, based on the chapter that I wrote together with Tobias, roads in High Asia, right? I mean, by now, many of these roads are perceived as being Chinese infrastructure, but if we look at the history of these roads, obviously these are patchworks of all sorts of actors. So I wouldn't say, if you look at a case like that, you don't have any kind of clear-cut boundary, because there is a public perception, political sort of discourse on these infrastructures, and also what the Chinese themselves claim as their infrastructure in terms of trade and investments in Tajikistan, for instance. But if you look at the very concrete history of these roads over the recent years, then they've been built by Turkish companies, financed by Gulf states, and now they're being used for kind of trade connections with China. So based on my chapter, I wouldn't say there is any clear-cut distinction. It's very situational what Chinese infrastructure in inverted commas even is.
That is a very tricky question. There's a recent volume that came out about it, actually, edited by Jessica DiCarlo and Seth Schindler, that looks, it's called The Infrastructural State, that looks at U.S.-Chinese geopolitical competition and the kind of infrastructures that are produced as a result of that, which I'm also a contributor to. But the main argument for the book is that, infrastructures take a life of its own, and despite these geopolitical kind of tensions, however, these kinds of infrastructures have, other kinds of, there are desires by multiple agents that shape and form these forms of infrastructure. So it's difficult to sort of clearly categorize it just purely based on, these types of characteristics. And so one of the questions that I'm going to pose instead of answer is to what extent is that experience and expertise actually transferable, and to what end is that categorization even helpful when the Zambian state approaches China to invest in something, rather than China saying, I will invest in this particular project.
Thanks. I'll just say one very brief thing. And I don't think necessarily this is unique to China, but one thing I have been very interested in with respect to Chinese infrastructure is the integration, as somebody who works on digital infrastructure, is the kind of integration between the digital and the physical forms of infrastructure. And I think, yeah, again, I'm not sure there's something completely unique, but if you think about something like the infrastructure associated with the social credit system in China, that this is both digital and physical, and it absolutely depends on that integration in order for it to do what it does, right? So I think there's something interesting about the kinds of infrastructure that's emerging in China about that. Yeah.
So yeah, thanks a lot. And actually, maybe it's to kind of continue on the same line. My question was, because it was mentioned at the very beginning that infrastructure, or the happening place was Europe and North America in the past, and now it's, for a certain period of time, it's been Asia. So what's the difference between these is there an Asian style of infrastructure compared to the prior European? What are the modalities of infrastructure? Other than merely a historical change or even new technologies, whatever, how would we, is there a different conception of the Asian infrastructure as opposed to the European?
Maybe an obvious point, but population densities. So, I'm working on a number of projects in Europe now, and we are looking at case studies from Singapore, from Hong Kong, but just the commercial viability of these things is very difficult to replicate, even in high-density European cities, because it's just a completely different level of footfall, for example. So that calls for, I would say, also it necessitates often integration of different types of infrastructure into a single system or building, which actually, for the future, would be a good thing in terms of thinking about the environmental footprint. The second thing I would say, in at least in terms of what I do in aviation, numerous American aviation planners in private have praised Chinese planning processes to me for the simple reason that rather than doing what they do in the U.S., which is, you bring in a planner, and he does a master plan or a land use plan, and then later you bring in the engineers and they say, oh no, wait, that won't work because there's this watershed, that sort of thing. So rather than having things be done sequentially, there's much more integrated planning, where you have different disciplines represented from the get-go at the beginning of the process. That's starting to happen more in Europe and North America, but that is something that is fairly standard in a lot of Chinese projects that I am familiar with. And I would say, the third thing is maybe there's a certain brand consciousness among Asian consumers, and that doesn't just have to do with handbags, but it also has to do with the architects that you hire. When we think about when the typical airport or train station or even electricity power stations were being built, the bulk of that was being built in the 19th and 20th century in the United States. Most of us would not be able to say who the lead architect was, right? When it comes to Asian mega projects, that's a Zaha Hadid, that's a Norman Foster, that sort of thing. And that is not something that's uniquely Asian, but it happens to be that this infrastructure was built at a time when this sort of idea of a starchitect emerged. Yeah.
Maybe just talking about the concept of the book as well. I mean, to go a little away from the idea of like Asian infrastructure. I think one of the reasons why we put Asia kind of conceptually in that book is basically to get rid of the kind of traditional and conventional regional studies categories, to show precisely that if you compare infrastructure connectivity based on infrastructures between different conventionally conceived regions, you get a lot of synergies and comparison out of that. So that's definitely one of the intentions that was behind that, and that wasn't necessarily meant to say that there is kind of something inherently Asian in these infrastructures.
I would just maybe reiterate the point that Max made at the very beginning with respect to the Chinese infrastructure and the kind of top-downness of of the process, right? And because that's, I mean, again, maybe it's not something that's completely generalizable across all of these instances or across all of Asia, but certainly in the Singapore example, that is very true, right? The top-down approach, the very heavy involvement of the state, the lack of consultation, right, and the ability to, so it's tied to, again, to this particular kind of governance. And I think that the Singapore model in that respect has been very influential in other parts of Asia, including in China, right? So it's yeah.
Maybe. We don't want weird codes coming in. Maybe I would add a thought that is counter to the sort of top-down. Most of Asia is not top-down or authoritarian in the same way that Singapore and China is. And I wonder whether or not there are ways to start thinking about the Asian forms of infrastructure that are emerging from societal activities or practices that are counter to these sort of top-down governmental processes for large, I work on large infrastructural projects, but I think Jessica Loughran's paper offers a counter-argument to the forms of governance and regulation that are also unique to this particular kind of context.
That's true. Other questions?
I've got a question. Sorry, Ben Oakwinter from HKU Geography. I've got a question for Dorothy. I wanted to ask about could Hong Kong ever be completely water self-sufficient if they didn't have the water from the Dongjiang? Could they do it? And because I know that there's population pressures, there's consumption pressures, pollution pressures on that water supply. So if people reduce their consumption, could it even be possible to rely solely on just Hong Kong sourced water?
I now live in Singapore, and they have done a really good job of demonstrating that technology works, apparently. That's a really good question. So the problem, if we look at Hong Kong from that particular historical moment when the British, I don't want to say landed, but when the British occupied Hong Kong Island, the original water supply was essentially all these wells, informal wells, because there were no perennial streams. It was seasonal streams, which are not reliable. And so from the very get-go, the moment that the population increased in Hong Kong, sort of when immigrants started coming, or colonialists, whatever, there was never sufficient water supply to begin with. So every time we built a reservoir, Pakfulam Reservoir, that you can hike to from here, that was the first reservoir. And the moment that was, before it was even completed, there was already not enough supply that it could ever provide for the population of people in Central and so on and so forth. So this continual expansion, it never ever met the demand for the population until we started importing water from China. And so it's a weird conundrum where scarcity is produced, but it also is a response to the population growth. And it was interesting in a lot of the literature and government kind of records that I read. There was always this justification, like, I'm so sorry that we can't provide water to you, but the landscape is just unhospitable and we just have so many people. And so it became not a crutch necessarily in that discourse, but there was never going to be enough water to provide for that population. Now, I think that Singapore has demonstrated with enough money and investment in technology, at least 50% of the water in Singapore is now produced through various forms of water management. But that also required a very particular kind of...
Yeah, can you give some more detail on that?
Okay, so we drink sewage water in Singapore, and there was a lot of government work that went into promoting, getting people used to the idea that we now had a sewage to tap facility called New Water. They branded it, right? Like the prime minister drank the water in front of everyone at a press conference. So there are definitely measures to do so. And actually in the 60s, there were newspaper articles in Hong Kong that criticized the British colonial government for building all of this expensive reservoirs and infrastructure because it was so much cheaper to just buy water from China. Even British newspapers criticized the British colonial government for doing that. So I don't know I'm not answering your question necessarily, but contextually it's very difficult. And even Singapore with its technological prowess still cannot provide water. And they, I would say, have stricter water policies than Hong Kong does for their population, which is smaller than Hong Kong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any last questions? Well, then I'd like to very much thank you all for joining us today. And again, please do check out the book under infrastructureasia.net. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes when I'm in this kind of event, I'm a bit shy about asking a question in front of a large audience. So what I'd suggest we do is maybe the four of us can stick around here in the front. If any of you want to ask any of your questions individually, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'd like to thank again very much the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, and especially Angela Dunn. And thank you all for joining us today.